Welcome, everybody. I'm back in another episode with Bill, and today we're going to be talking about complexity. We're also going to be talking about faith, religion, Parmenides, and monism. So I want to welcome Bill back. It's been a little while since we last talked, and why don't we start off with a couple pleasantries, Bill? How have things been going? And by things, I just mean the day-to-day.
Things. Well, the things is a philosophically fraught issue, but I know what you mean. I'm doing actually much better. I had some injuries to my back almost a year ago, and they're finally getting resolved, and I'm able to take my 2 or 3 mile hikes like I used to, like I enjoy. And so things are good. Things are good. And I'm down here in Texas where it's very hot, but today it's raining. So we like that in Texas. It's good.
I bet.
Yeah.
And
you're in DC, right?
So yeah, we're on the Pacific Coast, and I just had the CBC radio, which is our socialist national broadcast.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. I have to always contrast this with any American listeners, is that we actually have a national broadcast that's sponsored by the government, basically, and it's a little different than the United States. That is definitely more of a libertarian sort of bent. Mm-hmm. So anyway, some of the highlights on the CBC this morning were, just telling us that in BC specifically, where I live on the coast on the Pacific Coast, we're approaching that wildfire season.
I just talked to a friend of mine whose name is Mireille Evans, who lives near Nelson. She's moving 2 hours north. She and a couple of friends and their baby are going to move 2 hours north. Specifically, many reasons, but one of the reasons is to get out of the fire zone. And that's just awful. I was up there several years ago, and it was just gorgeous in the Nelson area, and the Kootenays. Beautiful, moist green. And, to think of that whole area as being under fire watch is just sort of devastating.
Tragic. I mean, when I grew up, I'm from Alberta on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, and beautiful British Columbia is where we hoped to go for our holidays. I mean, it was lush and green, and some would say it was God's country. It was so beautiful with the volcanic substrate of the lakes. Throughout that mountainous area and through the Okanagan, it's kind of a shame that it gets so devastated year in and year out with the effects of climate change.
So talking about complexity, that's an example of climate change, and is an example of the complexity we all deal with. That there's so many different variables and inputs and stuff that it's very hard to deal with. I mean, so in another aspect of complexity, there's the physical complexity, right? Mm-hmm. So there's more and more particulates in the air, and how close the Earth gets to the sun, and so forth, and the seasons. But then there's the political complexity. How do we deal with it? Everybody who's has any sense knows that we need to reduce emissions, and we need to do lots of different things in order to stave off the worst effects of climate change. But the human sort of tribal conflicts get in the way of rational action on a planet-wide basis. And frankly, that's something I haven't been able to figure out. I mean, I can advocate that we try to work for the greater good of all concerned. And if everybody does that, then everybody will be better off. Great. But some people they don't see the big picture. All they see is their small picture, and they see themselves as being in conflict with other people for resources. And certainly without a lot more planning and development and sort of social constitution, that is the case. There's competition for resources. But if we want to all just get off of that and cooperate, it'll all be better for everybody. Okay, but how do you do that? Well, I regret to say I haven't figured out the answer yet. And if I had, I haven't figured out how to convince everybody of my answer. Right?
You know, Bill, I've really thought about this. I lean more towards I go to Plato pretty much, and I don't know if it's not necessarily by choice. I just think that as a thinker, I can relate with him a little bit more. And I know you're not quite on that, but I want to sketch out something for you here. Some of Plato's most devastating failures in terms of philosophical oeuvre, right? Like his opus, his magnum opus, whether it's the beginning of the Republic or the subsequent laws that he starts to unfold. For me, this is a telling sign of exactly what complexity is. He's a brilliant thinker. I mean, that's a given. We can say, he was a brilliant thinker.
All of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato, as Whitehead said.
Yes, yeah, right. But I think where it starts to fall apart, it gets almost infinitely complex when you start to try and predict or move societies. So, and there is my friend George.
Oh, he's coming. Good.
He's joining us here.
Okay.
Good morning, George.
Good morning. My apologies. I'm still on Colorado time or something, so I can't. I'm not a very good time traveler, although I love long now and the issues of dealing with time and space, and I'm not a very good navigator at time changes. Bill, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, sir. Nice to meet you.
George, let me do a proper introduction, and then let me brief my, this is your starship, right? Okay, so let me brief the commander here. So I'll help with the navigation. How's that?
Sounds great.
Okay, all right. So I wanted to bring the two of you together because I've been working with Bill for, I guess, since the beginning of the year, roughly. Isn't that right, Bill?
Several months. Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but it's been a while. Yeah.
And it's not a terrible amount. I mean, we have a once a month touch point, and we jump on, and this is kind of the rinse repeat that we did with consciousness and consilience. Right. And so we're gonna stop. I think we've done 4 or 5 recordings. I think they went pretty good. I think we've done a fair representation of at least cursory sort of introductory sort of video recording of what Bill has to offer, at least in form of an introduction. We buttressed that and put some of his material on planksip, much the same as what we did with George. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at. My feeling was, as I said, I got to introduce you to George, and I wanted to bring the two of you guys together. And I know that George will go into it a little bit more about what he's actually working on. But we went from our project, which was the consilience and consciousness conversation, into more of a focus on complexity. And George is not alone. He's involved with several organizations that find that topic very interesting and stimulating. I believe there's a somewhat of a tie-in with effective altruism. There's projections into the future involving time capsules, and a very interesting group. So George, why don't you introduce what you're up to, what you hope to achieve, and then we'll bounce it back over to Bill.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So it's been a long journey. I'm 71 now, so it's had several different twists and turns over the years. But one of the themes that I've really come to embrace is the idea that our lives move in spirals, and we'll visit something and then a little bit later come back to it and hope we're a little bit wiser and smarter the second time around or the third time around. And that metaphor ties in in my mind, with the process that we see in complex systems, complex dynamic systems, which often resolve into spirals. And, we see that in the, in the beauty of nature and creation, the spirals in the galaxies, the spirals of spinning, whirling meteorological systems, and the spirals in nature. So that's been an inspiration for me. And while I started out many years ago, very interested in mathematics and science, kind of the idea that everything could be figured out. If you have just lost internet connection.
No, we got you still there.
Oh, you got me? Okay, I'm getting a little dialing ball here, dialing spiral. So it strikes me that there is a process at work that we only dimly see, when we approach scientific questions in a particular frame, or philosophical questions with a particular frame, and that has to do with the inherent nature of complexity. So we had a great series of conversations, Daniel, on E.O. Wilson's great book on consilience, trying to bring the different branches of science together with a common view and a common vocabulary. And that helped set a frame for the conversations that I'm now starting with complexity science practitioners.
There we go. So his internet did stop there.
Well, darn.
Darn.
Maybe he'll come back, but as George was speaking, he was saying, "Oh, spiral is this fundamental pattern."
Okay, I'm back in. I'm not sure.
It's back.
Not sure where I stopped.
Well, we're gonna push it over to Bill, because he's on the spiral, so he's responding in a spiral-like fashion. So go ahead, Bill.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned spirals, and one of the fundamental patterns in the universe. I've been studying along with my wife, who's a permaculture teacher for many years, the discipline of permaculture. Mm-hmm. And in I don't know if you know about permaculture. It's Okay, good. So for the listeners, permaculture came from originally meant permanent agriculture, ways to maximize the use and the sustainable use of land, and expanded to sustainable use of all kinds of things in society. But within permaculture, there's a number of different patterns. Spiral is one of the main ones, but there's also the scatter pattern. There's nets, which collect things. There are lobes that perturb things that protrude from the edges, and it says the edge is the most productive part of a system, because you've got something's happening over here, something happening here, and the edge is very, very productive. So, and there's a number of other ones. There's cloud forms and streamlines and waves. There's all very interesting thing about, I forget the exact terminology, but you see a flow pattern, then it hits an obstacle, and then it makes waves afterwards. So you'll see in a stream bed, for instance, there'll be a rock, and then a depression after the rock, and then it kind of gradually comes out. But that's because the water has gone over the rock, spiraled around. But it is a spiral, but it's a circular thing. It's not a continuing thing. It just twirls around and then goes on. So I guess my point is that spiral is one of the very important patterns of how things work. And there are a number of others as well. So I'm wondering if you have investigated the other ones, if you see why is spiral so important, and is it the most important? What do you think about that?
For me, it's a useful metaphor. It's not necessarily the be all and the end all, but it's a very useful metaphor.
Okay.
And it actually has a sort of an interesting a philosophical, theological root in the work of Emanuel Swedenborg. I don't know if you're familiar with Emanuel Swedenborg, but he was a scientist of the 18th century, and then at the age of 50, he had visions and began an extensive series of theological writings. But in his Principia, which is his effort to codify the physics of the day, he talked about the universe at its fundamental unit being the point, and the point in motion, and the motion that he described was the motion of a gyre, which is kind of a spiraling, tunneling kind of figure, not necessarily spiraling out, but just moving in circular motions through time. Which if there's a reasonable basis at all in the concept of motion being at the core of what happens in physical systems, then in some sense everything moves in something like a spiral or like a gyre. I mean, here we are sitting on the Earth. The Earth is spinning. Spinning on its axis. The Earth is moving around the sun. So we have these nested intersections of spiral-like motions.
We do. Yes.
I have something I want to ask. I think it's important. So George, in the Swedenborg tradition, are you aware of any introduction or elaboration or acknowledgement of the concept of Energia? I think that's how you pronounce it. It's the movement within the sphere that I believe Aristotle started to bring up in physics, in his book of physics. And so it's the motion inside of the sphere. Are either one of you guys aware of that?
My understanding of Aristotle is limited, but he had the idea of, and you said Energia, I would say Energia, but I'm not an expert on Greek pronunciation, that there was a certain movement that was inherent to things. Mm-hmm. Contra, for instance, Parmenides, who says, "Oh, nothing moves at all." Well, because you wanted to talk about Parmenides monism, but as to whether that Energia was within a sphere, I reluctantly don't actually know.
Yeah, and I can't add to that either, except I think it seems to be foundationally true that if you have no motion, you have you don't have any. You have nothing if you have no motion. So
that's interesting, because Plato's forms have no motion. The form of a triangle, say, okay, very simple. It's the same no matter where you look at it, no matter when you are, no matter whether you conceive it, draw it on a piece of paper, talk about it. It's always the same. It's unchanging. Bertrand Russell, and then following him, Alfred North Whitehead, call them eternal objects. They're not objects that continue through time. They're not immortal objects. They're eternal objects. Every time you look at it, you contemplate or look at or think about a triangle, it's the same thing. And that's timeless. So, but if there were nothing but forms with no time, if we could even conceive of such a thing, then it would be equivalent to, from our point of view, of just nothingness, no movement, right. Nothing's happening, right?
Right.
So the idea that things are happening is fundamental to our life. Things are always happening. In certain meditative traditions, you attempt to bring your mind by failing to, removing your attention from the outside world, and you putting it to a point, and you attempt to come to a point of stillness. Well, I can't say that I've ever actually achieved this. I've come close once or twice. But in that stillness, it's just stillness. There's nothing going on. Mm-hmm. Now, as you come out of the stillness and back into the world of change and spirals and nets and all the stuff that happens, then the idea is that you'll have some insights that'll help you deal better with the complexities of your life, right?
Yeah.
So there's this balance. It's like a yin and yang. You never have yin without a yang. You never have yang without a yin. You never have complete stillness without some movement. And if you had complete movement with no stillness, it would I can't imagine that either, but it would be sort of like chaos if there were no form, if there were nothing, if there were no spiral such that, oh, you recognize you've been here before in a slight different capacity, it would just be chaos, and that would be essentially the same as nothingness. So we're here in the middle. We are here in a world of change that has static elements. We're here in a world that has static elements, but things are changing all around. But that's what we need to deal with.
And Bill, I'm reminded of, I don't know if you're familiar with Roger Penrose's Three Worlds, where he sort of describes the three different worlds. And then he says, well, they're really all part of the same world. But those three are as you point out, the mathematical world, or the world of forms, which is eternal and timeless.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the physical world, which is the one that we live in, and we know and we see and we experience directly. And then there's also the world of consciousness, which again has some very different characteristics from the other worlds, and doesn't necessarily, I mean, there's a big argument about the nature of consciousness, but he sort of characterizes those three worlds as three parts of that we have to try and understand. And several people have followed up with the three mysteries that that relate those three worlds together. So one is that the physical world follows mathematical laws.
Right. Yes.
And nobody quite knows why. That's Eugene Wigner's, great 1960 essay on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, which I really enjoy. And then from the physical world and the action in that physical world, somehow arises the phenomenon of consciousness.
So let me ask you this. I know you're on a roll here, but when you say the word consciousness, and this is one of my things that I've been dealing with for a while. Consciousness is a word. It sounds like a noun. It sounds like, oh, I've got a rock. Oh, I've got consciousness. Oh, I've got a triangle. But what is this thing called consciousness? I assert that there is no such thing as consciousness. And we ought to quit using the word consciousness because it sounds like a static thing. Oh, I've got consciousness. It's like I got a blue shirt. Well, no. I am conscious. I'm conscious of all kinds of things. Sometimes I'm acutely conscious of what I'm focusing on. Sometimes I'm diffusely conscious of lots of stuff, but I don't have consciousness. Okay, so that's my hobby horse.
You are conscious?
Yeah. I am conscious.
Yeah.
When I'm talking to you, you're conscious of me.
Yeah.
I mean, so we can talk about episodes or states of being conscious. We can talk about the capacity to be conscious. We can talk sometimes, these are various meanings of the term consciousness. And I'm saying you ought to be, instead of using the word consciousness, use something that's more precise about what you're trying to say. So in Penrose's case, all right, there we have mathematical timeless objects. We have the physical world, which is changing, but it seems to operate by physical law, or describable by physical law. And then we have what? If we say we don't have, if we don't want to use the words consciousness, how would you characterize his third thing?
Let's use it as the capacity for self-reference, self-reflection, self-awareness, and that includes the awareness of an entity with agency, free will and agency. Okay. So it operates in the physical world. Our choices make an effect in the physical world, but there's not any clarity about the what that experiential side, what that phenomenological side of consciousness, or the capacity of being conscious and self-reflective actually is. And David Chalmers talks about the problem of qualia. I don't necessarily know that that's the big problem, but the sense that consciousness is a state of awareness that is characterized by an experience that doesn't it can't be explained away by looking at the physical activity of the brain, for example.
Okay, good. When you say consciousness is a state of awareness, just in English, we have two words: consciousness, awareness. Both they're basically, they're almost what do you call them? Synonyms.
Yeah.
Because consciousness is a state of consciousness, such as we, so. But you make a good point. The physical world is a world of objects. The human world, social world, is a world of agents. And not just human, but there's animal agents, there's plants who have a certain amount of agency and so forth. So there's some category of entities in the world that we know of things in that category are more than just inert stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to take into account their world in such a way that they can act on it rather than being only, they move by themselves as opposed to being hit by something that moves. Right.
And the one addition to that I would add is that the capacity for self-reflective consciousness, or the awareness of the awareness, is a very important feature. And I think it, to my mind, harkens, we see the issue of recursive functions in mathematics and the basis of Gödel's incompleteness theorem and the halting problem, Turing's halting problem. So we see that issue of self-reflective recursiveness appearing in mathematics and creating a significant puzzle. And we also see it in the observer problem in quantum physics in the real world. So there's some piece of this puzzle that is made even more mystical by this sense of self-reflection and recursion.
Yes. My contention is that the ability, as you say, for self-reflection or metacognition or self-awareness, I like to call it second-order thinking, that is the peculiarly human virtue in the Greek sense. It's arete. It's what we do that we do it better than anything else that we know of. And that's a sort of an empirical claim. We might find that in some way whales have the same capacity, but for now, humans have this special capacity we have a vast intelligence, and we can use tools to build things and investigate physical reality.
Where's your sample data on the vast intelligence? I have to ask about that. Sorry, right. I am too irresistible. It just dangles it right there. I had to interject that. A little comic relief. Okay, go ahead.
We got 3 examples here. Okay. So.
Vast. Let me tell you.
Okay, but we're really highly intelligent. We can direct that intelligence at the world and build tools and bridges and computers and all kinds of stuff. And then we can turn it, as you say, self-reflectively on ourselves. That's the crucial thing. That gives us free will. That gives us the ability, as the existentialists say, to have freedom to create ourselves. We're not just, we create our essence. We're not just what we find ourselves to be. We can create ourselves to be something different. So that's really a crucial element, and the fact that the more we can hone that ability and do it well, then we are more likely to live satisfactory and even flourishing lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and just sort of then, according to the Penrose 3 worlds, that world of those capacities that you just referenced that self-reflective capacity
Mhm.
doesn't, it's a different phenomenon than the physical world, and it's a
Yes.
different phenomenon than the mathematical world.
Okay.
And he poses the third mystery of the trio being the fact that consciousness can then perceive these abstract forms
Right.
and manipulate them and make use of them and apply them in making choices. So that's the model of the three worlds that, again, I find it a useful metaphor to be able to think about, and it's still mysterious, as Penrose says when he talks about this, as well. There's something about these three worlds. They're really just one world, but we just can't figure out how they all relate together, or we may never really be able to figure that out.
And that's okay. Like there's like the world is composed of physical stuff and chemical stuff and biological stuff and astronomical stuff. And each discipline has its own way of describing the world. You could describe the function of a pancreas, for instance, in purely atomic terms, but it wouldn't be at all as useful as the term as describing it in chemical terms. And that's not quite as useful as describing it in biological terms. You know, chemical terms, what does the pancreas do? It does certain chemical operations on stuff that passes through it. But in biological terms, it has a function within a living body. None of these descriptions are wrong. They're all descriptions, and they're useful in different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
So it's okay with me that we have lots of these descriptions, that we just pick the tool that we need for our present purposes.
Right. Absolutely right. And one of the problems I see is when the tools that we're using in one of those areas then becomes a tool that gets applied to all areas.
Right. All you have is a hammer. Everything looks like a nail, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think one of those, one of the big debates is causal closure.
Right.
And most, I think, scientists and physicists that spend their time thinking about the physical world and it's the way it works have an affinity with the concept of causal closure and a kind of a deterministic sense of how the laws of nature apply. And there are some that still feel that if you knew all the initial conditions perfectly, you could run the laws of nature and it would all come out. Or even the concept of the space-time continuum, the Minkowski loaf, that, our future in some slice of the space-time continuum is somebody else's past. Therefore, in a certain sense, it's a determined kind of concept. So that, I think, is an example in my own mind where a principle that seems to be useful in one set of areas of inquiry, then when it comes over into another, for example, the issues of consciousness and agency and efficacy, muddy the water, so that it becomes difficult to have clarity about the actions of agents and the choices that we make actually having efficacy in the physical world, because it's been clouded by this principle that practitioners in one area think is more important.
And it used to be the other way around. It used to be human beings saw everything as agents, pretty much.
Yeah.
There's the special tree that has the knowledge. If you go there, then you get some insights because the tree is telling you things. And that worked quite well, actually, for several 100,000 years. But now we know more about physical reality, and we could do more impressive things, build rocket ships and stuff, that the ancients, the prehistoric people, they would think that was magic. Okay. But as you say, if we take the physical description and try to apply it to the realm of agency, doesn't quite fit. Just like we take the principle of agency and try to apply it universally to the world, that sometimes doesn't fit either. There's a big flood, and it's because the gods were angry. Well, no, it's because you should have made a dam upstream and contained it. So,
yeah, I like that way of thinking about it, in the sense that full-blown mysticism is really an over-reliance on some of the experiences of consciousness and our experiential aspect and how we relate to the world, turning that into mystical explanations and denying the scientific ones is just as much of an overreach as using the strictly scientific empirical methods and saying that that's all there is, and the experiential, the phenomenological really doesn't apply, and we just explained it all away. We can explain consciousness by the way the neurons work together and in the physical world. So I like that. I really like that way of making that point.
What interests me, what puzzles me, is how does the mathematical realm fit into this? You have physical stuff. You have agents that can do things, move on their own, and you have these eternal objects. And I don't have the answer. It seems to me, and in this sense, Daniel, I'm somewhat a Platonist. It seems to me when we discover laws of logic and we work theorems out and stuff, we're actually discovering things. We're not making them up, right? So there's some I want to say reality, but reality in the sense of you don't get to just make it up. It's right. Stubborn. There's a certain stubbornness about math.
Yeah.
That one and one always going to make true. Yeah, no matter where you are and what you're doing, one and one always makes two. They're the same kind of things, right?
Yeah, and I've done a meditation in one of my pieces that kind of pokes at that issue a little bit, Bill, because if you think about the beginning, in a metaphysical sense, the transition from nothing to something is like making a distinction or counting something. One, going from 0 to 1 is making a distinction.
Okay.
When you've created that distinction now, and you start to be able to have operational capacities in the world of mathematics. If you have one distinction, you make another distinction, and then you have two, and then if you have 1 and 2 and 3, now you have the counting numbers,
right.
And from the counting numbers, you have the capacity with the axiomatic method to build all of mathematics, and it is in a certain sense that initial distinction between 0 and 1, from which all of mathematics then descends.
Right. This reminds me of something from the Tao Te Ching. The 10,000 things are born of being. Being is born of not being. Different way of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
That
so,
there was
very much a mystical concept of going from nothing to one. Is a foundational act of creativity or creation in the existence of the universe, and from that, the mathematical Platonic world, you could say it emerges in an instant, because those are eternal relationships that result from that initial distinction and separation. And in a certain sense, consciousness ties in with that, because consciousness is the awareness of a distinction between self and other, and the awareness of self. So in a certain sense, there's a pattern at the heart of consciousness that's similar to the pattern at the heart of mathematics. And I think you could look at quantum physics as well and look at what would be theorized as the Big Bang, where, you know, prior to that fundamental event, there was a nothingness, but a potentiality, and then that potentiality springs into physical existence.
The issue for me is there was nothing prior to. The concept of prior to is a concept
there was no
within
prior
time.
to.
There was no prior to. There was no time. There was no space. There wasn't anything to the left of it. There wasn't anything to the right of it. There wasn't anything before it or after it. So it's like, but does that mean, relating to being conscious, does that mean the initial creation of the universe is in some way like waking up from a dreamless sleep? Bingo, you're awake. There's a world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in our case, we remember there was a world before when we went to sleep and so forth. But there's that transition from not to is.
Yeah, and it seems to be like an on and off switch in the sense of, you know, when you wake from sleep, it's not like you can identify a gradual continuum. Somewhere in the brain, there's a continuum of processes that happen, but there's the point of awakeness. And similar to the point of consciousness or self-awareness or self-reflection, of becoming aware, being able to identify yourself in a mirror as yourself, you know, those things it's like an on-off switch as opposed to a continuum.
Although there's a phase transition, like this morning, I woke up and I was hazily remembering my dream and then hazily thinking about what am I going to do? I got to talk to Daniel at 10 o'clock and then I'm awake. So there is a transition.
Yeah, but it is
like
a phase transition. You're right. It's a phase transition. So in the physical world, when you see a phase transition, it seems to have a time continuum. You know, like when ice crystallized. You know,
yes.
there is somewhere in that form. You know, there would be one instant where something starts to happen and it triggers the cascades through the network, so it all happens.
Mm-hmm.
But it may be more useful to think of that phase transition as a timeless process, as opposed to a time sequential process. I don't know, that, you know, that's a little bit of a speculation, but what strikes me is now we've got this mathematical world comes into existence with that initial distinction. So there's a phase transition, you know, it pops into existence. And they talk about the physical world and the Big Bang, you know, sort of popping into existence and then cascading. And then consciousness seems to also have this quality of on-offness that pops into.
See, that's what I question that. I don't think our ability to be conscious, and I don't think episodes of being conscious are either on or off. You can be conscious, like if I'm focusing on something, whatever it is, writing something or poking things in the ground for a garden, I'm focused. But in that same experience, I'm dimly aware of my surroundings. If I'm outside, the wind and the sunlight and so forth, I'm inside, various noises. In other words, our experience is not on or off. It's like there's a phase. Sometimes I can just sort of daydream and be vaguely aware of my surroundings, but vaguely aware of my daydream. So it's mushy. So I don't think it's on and off. And this idea of being conscious as relating to being self-aware, lots of entities are conscious, like my dog, or cats, birds, and even plants give every indication of being conscious of their environment in a different way from just being impinged, you know, like the rocks can move because some other rock hit it. A billiard ball is different. They seem to have they take into account their environment in some way. On an analogy with our own experience, we think, well, they probably experience the world kind of, sort of like we do, right? But probably the dog isn't much self-reflective. Probably the dog doesn't have much metacognition. So I want to make a distinction between just being conscious and having this metacognition.
Right. I agree with that completely. Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I also think that metacognition, like if you're in the garden and you're doing the gardening, there's conscious, intelligent activity taking place. But when are you aware that you are aware? When is that something that is, again, that on-off switch, that metacognition, pops into consciousness when the awareness, recursively flows back to itself.
Yeah.
And I think that's a powerful property. I think we see that powerful property work in mathematics, and I think that's a powerful feature of that. And I did make reference to it in one of the essays I wrote for the FQXI essay contest, referring to it as autonoetic consciousness. Okay. So that's a term that's just come out in the last few years that I kind of like, because there's noetic consciousness, which is simply more like stimulus response. It's an awareness of surroundings and a response to surroundings.
Right.
And then
anoetic, not knowing at all.
Yeah, there's noetic, anoetic, and then autonoetic. And autonoetic is the point at which you're aware of the conscious processes that are going on. So
you're aware. Second order thinking, that's the metacognition.
Metacognition. And I kind of made the analogy to in complex systems. It's probably a little too much trying to get into now, but making the distinction between
much too complex, right?
yeah, it's very complex. But making that distinction is important, and the autonoesis that occurs. I drew an analogy to the autonoesis that occurs in quantum physics and the autonoesis that occurs in mathematics with Gödel's theorem, the incompleteness theorems. And to me, there seems to be something there for trying to make sense of how these three different worlds, if you want to call it that, have a relationship together. And if you go back to that point of creation where that 0-1 distinction, is the point at which all of mathematics pops into being. Mm-hmm. That nothingness to somethingness that happens in the physical world with that quantum event, and the Big Bang pops into existence. Takes a while to evolve, and then that point where consciousness becomes intelligence or agency becomes aware of itself is when that foundational consciousness pops into being. And I think you can think of it as a very mystical thing, very much like the Buddhist concept of nothingness. And
it's very mystical. I'm just thinking, it just occurred to me, maybe that state, in quotes, before, because it really wasn't before the world, was a state of being asleep, or maybe it was a state of mere noesis, but not autonoesis. In other words, maybe there was stuff happening and parts of the stuff was conscious of the other parts of the stuff and so forth, but none of it knew that it was happening. And maybe this is like mystical, metaphorical speculation. Okay, maybe that initial, there's something going on and I'm part of it. Bingo, that was that initial point.
Yeah.
Wow. I think you're advocating for a little bit of panpsychism there, Bill.
Well, yes.
which is interesting, which is very interesting. I want to kind of unify something here, because I've been a little bit quiet. George knows the theory that I've been able to formulate in my own head with the 0 and the 1, like the point in Euclideans. In Euclidean mathematics, the point is an undefined term, an axiom that has the point is breadthless. It has no dimension to it, and part of my work has been to give dimension to that. And the way I use the 1 is like two infinitesimals coming in a symmetry and converging within the point. It's the property of the point. Okay, and then so the difference between the right and the left, the up and the down, the symmetry, whatever it is a starting point for analysis is the Planck length at the beginning of the universe. And so I'm not going to get into that too much, but I think we all got inquisitive minds when it comes to either on-off or the conscious awareness. And what my question is for the three of us here is that how do you start to unify the thinking in this virtual room, right? And the reason why I bring that up is because I think the key to the success of something is going to be how that can be replicated and disseminated and accepted by other people. So if I can't get George and Bill to agree with what, the approach and the language and the terminology and the vision, so to speak, if I can't get you guys to agree and I can't agree with George and I can't agree with Bill, what hope do we have to have it affect a shift in paradigm?
So what is it you think we disagree about?
I don't think we disagree, but we seem to have like slight novel approaches to the understanding, right? We'll say something which I say is kind of almost like a defensible Platonic, like for me, right? It's a for me statement, so it's really form. But for me, you'd say, the universe is structured in this way, and so you're pulling what you have in terms of your own individual epistemological understanding of the world, and I'm converging it down into that constellation of information down to an understanding of the universe. And then I'm trying to communicate that to George, and I'm trying to communicate it to Bill. And there's a negating function there that says, I agree with most of that except for this, or I would see it like this, or I would. And so you go, okay, so then we end up with these like isolated islands of novelty. Then I think, well, how do we actually unify that in a way that
maybe we don't have
emerges.
to unify it. Maybe if we all agreed, welcome back, George, you disappeared for a bit. If we all
on off.
Right. But Daniel, if we all agreed, then it would be boring.
It would be that static thing that we were talking about earlier. It's an inert, and biologically, I think this can equivocate to a novelty function, because part of what the human condition is that we're novelty seeking querents. I mean, we ask questions, we're constantly, so right. In many cases, we're all on a pretty similar frequency here. And so, there's our convergence, there's our consilience, or jumping together, and to say, well, how, anyways, I'm going to leave that at that. Bill, I wanted to ask you about.
Before you go, the one thing I'll point out is we are using a tool that's been invented by autonomous conscious human beings, and that tool is language. And that language has a mapping function. It's always going to be inexact. It's always going to be approximate. And it may be that the purity you're seeking in terms of the purity of communication would really only be achievable through an infinite, not a regress, but an infinite progress towards a perfection where consciousness consciousness unite. And since we're using language, it's an imperfect process. We kind of have to struggle our way in that direction. I don't know if that's a useful metaphor.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so. The point I wanted to throw over to Bill is that there's a difference illustrated in the literature, academic literature, about cultural shift versus linguistic drift. And so what made me think about this is Bill's very insightful distinction in a noun verb of dichotomy or comparison, of consciousness, right? I think that's quite fascinating. It's very useful. And from what I understand on the linguistic drift standpoint is that we move from things to actions, right? So this is the linguistic drift hypothesis. And so we may describe consciousness as that entity, but when in fact it's what Bill's, I think he's trying to advocate for here is that it's more like a verb.
Yes. It's a process. It's an activity.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't have consciousness. We are conscious in varying degrees and varying durations and so forth, and varying intensities. So I don't know about linguistic drift. I don't know what that means, but
it might. But what
I do think clarity of be as clear as possible in our words, and that's something another thing I attempt to do. Just be as precise as you can, even given the limitations of language. You don't have to go overboard and be totally unclear and bizarre. I mean, unless you're a poet or a novelist, or but if you're trying to describe things, and particularly if you're trying to convey an idea to somebody else, number one, you want to be as precise as you can about your terminology and explain it. Number two, you want to listen to your audience and see what they're saying back to you to see if you can detect whether they've got it or not. So there's the linguistic drifts back and forth between hearer and speaker.
It's interesting, Daniel, you raising language, because you think about the fact that we do have a noun object identification. It's pretty critical of the English language, and that maybe that is part of why our physics is all focused on objects and forces. And one of the themes that seems to be coming up in complexity science is the theme of, it's not about the objects per se, but it's about the relationships. The relational, one writer calls it the relational ontology of these vast networks. And thinking about the word, a given noun is a referent. That reference has been used how many millions of times by human beings over a course of its trajectory to give it its denotation today. And that evolves as people use those words going forward. I mean, Google used to mean one thing, now it means something different. And so thinking about the relational dimensions of words, and then the relational dimensions of things in networks as the way we should, and we don't have the language to talk about that because our language is very much founded in this objects, categories, properties, forces.
Our English language is, and many of the European, Indo-European, but there's other languages, as I understand it, that are much more verb-oriented, process-oriented, and stuff. Oh, I'm not sitting next to my neighbor; I'm neighboring, that kind of thing. So, but they certainly our linguistic categories frame our perception of reality, and our perception of reality, in turn, frames our linguistic categories. So there's a sort of, I don't know if that's a spiral or not, but it's certainly a circular interaction kind of thing. Yeah.
So it's kind of amazing we can communicate at all.
Right.
One of the things that I know, if I know you guys, like I think I do, I don't think you guys spend much time in Heidegger's work.
False. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time, but I understand Heidegger to be describing the human situation from a very particular first-person point of view, using very particular very unusual language. It's unusual in German and it's unusual in English. And it's kind of descriptive. It's kind of poetic. It's an attempt to describe lived reality from a radical first-person point of view, and in that sense, he comes out of Husserl's phenomenological tradition. The issue is he just describing idiosyncratically Heidegger's view of life, or is he saying something general about all human beings or most human beings? He talks about Mitsein, for instance, being with. That whenever we are always with others, not in the sense of being in their physical presence. I can be off in my room alone, or I can be off in the forest or whatever, and the three of us are not physically present, although our images are. But it's not physically present. It's like our very being, the structures of how we operate are intertwined with other people. And so that's he uses the words Mitsein. Okay, very evocative. Well, ethologists such as Franz de Waal, for instance, say that human beings are obligatorily gregarious or ultra-social, that human beings evolved in groups, in tribes, and cannot survive without other people. You take an infant. I mean, they used to do this in Greek. There was an infant with a deformed leg. We'll just put them up on the side of the hill, and we'll come back later and we'll find a dead body. Humans absolutely must have other humans in order to survive. So do you say, oh, it's Mitsein, or is it obligatorily gregarious, or is it ultra-social, or there's all kinds of words for it in different points of view. Heidegger's point of view is from a radically first-person point of view, the kind of coming out, as I say, from Husserl's phenomenology. And once you get that, and once you get into sort of understand where he's coming from, then it starts to make sense, to me anyway. So
I like that, actually. That's very, very helpful and very useful. George?
I'd point out I had a great conversation a while back with another one of your friends, Brian Rogers, and I think he has spent some time with Heidegger. I haven't, so I can't opine on it much, but Brian certainly had a lot to offer. And I think, Bill, I like what you were saying, because that links back to this relational aspect. Our use of language. I mean, the language itself is a culturally developed, complex phenomenon that facilitates improved coordination of intelligent functions among human beings. So it's got an evolutionary value, but it's incredibly sophisticated and complicated. And we would have no language were it not for the hundreds and thousands of generations that came before that turned those, grunts and utterances and, into structured ways of communicating, very efficient ways of communicating that allows us to, talk about anything. So, and also, I mean, there's also an analogy.
Anything except the beginning of everything. Then we have trouble talking about it.
Yeah.
The things you can't, as Wittgenstein says, the things you can't talk about. So, and I also like the analogy. Now that's the linguistic networking and relational aspect of the human being. We've got the same thing with the genetic connections that, the original genetic material that's been traded around in very, very complex ways over a very, very long history that really link us to each other in a very visceral, physical way. I just think it's a wonderful way of thinking about the relational aspect of these things, as opposed to just simply objects and categories and the way we normally think about them and the way our language is based. Objects
and categories are abstractions from the real stuff, so to speak. Heidegger and Husserl would say they're abstractions from lived experience. A lot of people would say that. So, and regarding what we were saying earlier, if you take those abstractions and act as if they are the real thing. Whitehead calls it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. The physical building blocks of the universe are not what's most fundamental. What's most fundamental is process, movement, activity. Some of those movements happen over and over again such that they look pretty stable. So we'll call those objects. And they act like objects because the activities are so bound in a small way. They're the activities of the atoms and the molecules and so forth, and subatomic so-called particles. They're really activities, but they're activities in such a way that they're so repetitive that they act like self-same objects. What's really real is the activity.
Yeah, and every biological object looks like it's stable, and we have this continuum of identity that we attach to it, but it is a massive foment of biochemical, physical, it's chaos, but it is organized in forms that are self-sustaining and self-replicating, and so it appears to have this continuity, but really that's a bit of an illusion. Well,
it does have continuity until, it's like the human body. First you're an infant, and then you grow up, you're a kid, you're a teenager, you're an adult, you're a wise elder, we hope. And then it's going to the physical thing is going to decay, and then, where are you? Well, you're not, the physical thing's not there anymore. What endures is not the physical building blocks, because all the atoms in your body, they say, have changed in 7 years, all the molecules. What endures is the pattern of activity that endures through changes of physical composition. And that's
this is how I want to summarize the show, because I think we've got a nice conciliant point here. Maybe it can tighten up this idea of consciousness as a verb, as a moving towards something, both forward and backward in time, as I think would be inspired by Heidegger as well. But the idea is identity. Now, I want to build on this concept that George introduced about on and off, which there seemed to be a little bit of not quite an agreement between Bill and George about the on-off switch. Okay, we won't get into that too much, but it seems like we weren't quite there. And I back earlier in the conversation, I thought to myself, I said, well, what if we took this a little bit of a different way and we considered it through identity, right? So Bill doesn't cease to be Bill, right? And George doesn't cease to be George, even when the focus of conscious awareness. Well, and I know that's a tautology you don't like, Bill, but when it kind of goes in and out of focus, right?
Okay, good.
If one thing that does remain consistent through time is that Bill continues to be Bill and George continues to be George. So we can have a whole, philosophical line of thought as it relates to identity and this continuance through time of identity. And I'm wondering if, and then let's try and keep this under 15 minutes to wrap up at half past the hour. Let's try and summarize the usefulness of identity in regards to the process of conscious existence.
So when you say identity, there's that's a broad concept. I think of identity as a personal identity. In other words, I'm Bill, and I've been Bill for quite a number of years, and I expect to hope to be Bill for a few more years. What does that consist in? Well, there's a physical continuity. I'm getting this, by the way, from William James. There's a physical continuity. I have a body that used to be a little baby, then it grew up, and then it became a teenager, and then it, now it's this elder body. But there's a physical continuity. There's also a social continuity. People recognize me as the same person that they interacted with yesterday or 5 years ago or whatever. My sister, who's the oldest living person who actually knows me for that long, would know that I'm the same person as I was when she was 1 and I was 3 or whatever. So there's a continuity of social identity. There's also a continuity of, we might say, psychic identity or subjective identity. I feel like the same person I was yesterday. I wake up in the morning. How do I know I'm me? Well, because I'm in familiar surroundings, and my internal landscape is familiar of my thoughts, my feelings, my emotions, my bodily feelings, so forth. There's a certain sense of being me that I recognize. I don't have to pay attention to it. It's just, okay, I'm back in this familiar Billness, so to speak. So the identity is an identity of continuity of physical, social, and psychological or psychic or subjective patterns through time. So a diachronic unity. Now, some people lack the psychological, the subjective identity. Some people seem to have 2 or more, even more different people inhabiting the same physical body. Not at the same time, but one will become dominant, another one will become dominant. When one's dominant, the social interactions are different from the other one that's dominant. So it's like, what is this identity? Well, there's 2 identities in that, talking about schizophrenia. I'm not sure what the approved term is for today, but so that's this identity, dissociative identity disorder or something like that. But there seem to be 2 psychological people in the same physical body. So from the external point of view, I asked the same person as I saw him yesterday, or her, but they're acting weird today. What happens? Oh, it's because Bill A is in charge instead of Bill B, who's in the background. So you can't just say identity is this simple thing. It's a very complex thing. And then there's the other aspect of it. They're talking about diachronic identity. What about in any given instant? What makes me the same? What makes me one entity in any given instant of time? Now, that's also a fallacy of misplaced contrariness. There is no instant of time, but there's greater and shorter duration. So let's take a small duration of time. What makes me, me? How am I the same? There's a whole series of things you could say about that. But that's I'm talking about the personal identity. Now, you may also be talking about some philosophical identity of indiscernibles or something, but maybe that's enough for me right now. What do you think, George?
Bill, I think that was well said, and I really like your descriptions of the different ways of looking at personal identity. What struck me as you were going through each of those sets of examples is it's each of those is a complex set of relationships. Mm-hmm. So we have a very complex set of relationships with memories that are reflective of our past trajectory, expectations, a representation of our future trajectory. The language that we're using, which is, as we talked about before, related to the millions of human beings that have collected this language and refined it, and it has a particular set of relationships, semantic relationships to me at this place in time. And I'm also struck with the fact that it's a coherent physical entity, and specifically coherent in the sense of what's going on in the brain. So there is a coherent set of relationships flowing through the neuronal structures of the brain and the, and the parasympathetic system and all those, a coherent cohesiveness to those relationships that are holding together. And so all of those, whether the social relationships, the neuronal relationships in the brain, the historical relationships to past memories and events, all of those relationships create a stable, coherent identity. And when there are disruptions, for example, you describe people with multiple personalities, or people who've had brain injuries where their continuity of the relational structures among the neurons gets disrupted or broken, they'll lose that. And if they lose contact with their prior memories, that sense of identity just becomes a very, very different set of experiences. So I like the way you approached the description of identity, and I also think it points to this way of thinking about relationships and relational networks that are critical to be able to maintaining that coherent identity, and both that internal sense of identity continuity as well as the social coherent identity, and so again, that word identity becomes a lot of different things. But I really like the way you described that. Yeah. Is that helpful, Daniel?
I think that's great. I think it's a relatively perfect summary of the.
How can something be relatively perfect?
I know.
It's 0 or 1. Perfect or it's not perfect. Come on. But anyway, go ahead.
Hey, it's a process. We're moving towards perfection. Okay, so there we have it. I think we had a nice discussion today. I'm very happy to have brought the two of you together. I want to encourage both of you to reach out to each other, engage, continue to philosophize, and perhaps build a friendship. If you get stuck for each other's contact information, please do reach out to me.
Well, Daniel, please send an email
to
both of us, so we each have the other person's email, and then we'll go from there. By the way, George, I was looked up, what is it called, spiralsomething.org. The website's down. You might want to look into that. Spiral Inquiry.
Yeah, I'll take a look at it. I was traveling, so I'll just go take a look at it. Spiralinquiry.org is what it's.
Yeah, I said this domain is part courtesy of GoDaddy, so you might need to up your.
All right.
All right, but anyway, Daniel, thanks very much for bringing us together. Right. It's been lots of fun.
Yes.
Thanks, guys.
Pleasure to meet you. Thank you, Daniel.
You betcha. Okay, bye now. Bye.
Best of all. Bye.